Moving on, we've seen a dramatic trend over the year. A number of people that are interested in securing a backup residency or a second passport has tripled in our experience. Currently, since one of the most popular search engine terms is how do I relinquish a U.S. citizenship, I suppose as things get worse over time, it's only going to escalate. Any idea why that's happening now, Chris?
Yeah, because, this program of financial repression that the Federal Reserve is implementing in cahoots with the federal government, it has a number of cornerstones. So we talked about how that 99.5% are trapped in the system. So first thing they do is they create the negative real interest rates. The second thing they have to do, though, this is critical, is you have to create capital controls. You have to trap the people in the system. And so a lot of wealthier people, smarter people, people who are paying attention notice that the United States has been putting soft capital controls. They call it things like the FATCA, the FATCA Act, which really makes it very difficult for a U.S. citizen to open a foreign bank account. They've watched the Treasury Department reach all over the world with their tentacles saying we're going to make sure that anybody who's a U.S. citizen is completely at all times under our thumb. And so a lot of people have said, you know what, I'd rather not be under that thumb. And the only way to get out from under that is to relinquish your citizenship. It's not possible. It used to be possible to dodge it a little bit with a dual passport, but that's all being locked down. And they talk about it. We care about tax cheats. They put all these words on it. But the truth is, it's designed. They can't run an effective program of financial repression if people are escaping that. And so they're doing everything they can to lock that. The first step in this is soft capital controls. The next step is hard. And so that's what I think why you're seeing an uptick in those search engine terms you're looking at is because people have said, gosh, I might have to get out while I still can, because when the hard controls come, there's no chance.
I've often said in many of my posts, I'm a history buff as well, and when nations crash, your assets become your liabilities.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Chris, moving on, how do you feel about alternative investments such as precious metals, real estate, foreign real estate, farmland? Any thoughts on the role these alternative investments should play in the average American's portfolio right now?
Absolutely. If anybody came to me and said, hey, I have 100% of my wealth, and I'll put air quotes around that because it's not actually wealth. I have 100% of my wealth stored in paper dollars. I've got it in the stock market. I've got it in bonds. I've got it over there. I would say you have to have a minimum, personally, a minimum of 20% of that stored out in hard assets. Precious metals are my favorite because they're easy. Buying a farm, great. Buying land, great. Buying a productive real estate enterprise, great. But those are harder investments. Those are trickier. I think people should investigate those as well, but they're not for everybody. So for the person who says, hey, I'm leading my life, I'm busy as a dentist, a doctor, or whatever, and I've got extra money over here, what should I do with it? I'd say gold and silver. Start there. That's easy. And again, when we think about this wealth transfer, when people say, but how much? I say, well, as much as will allow you to sleep well, knowing that you may wake up one morning and there will be this wealth reset will happen. And all of a sudden you will find that your paper wealth will be worth something a lot less than you thought it was. So to sleep well, ask yourself this, how much would you need to have safely out of the hands of that? And that for me, that number is very, very high. I keep very little of my wealth in the paper world at this point because I don't trust it. And I sleep really well at night with my current holdings. And I don't spend a lot of time trying to figure out, am I advancing or declining in terms of dollar terms? I know how many ounces of gold and silver I have. I know how much land I own, and I'm comfortable with those numbers. So that's how I approach it. But, again, you mentioned like one of the classic examples, which was Argentina in 2000. People there woke up one day. They had dollars stored in bank accounts because they didn't trust the Argentinian currency. And they woke up one morning and the banks were all closed. And 2 weeks later, when the banks opened up again, all their dollars had magically disappeared. They'd been replaced on an equal numerical term with the Argentinian currency. It was an immediate 30% devaluation, but of course, inflation roared off from there. And so people who thought they were wealthy just woke up and discovered they weren't. And that's the nature of the paper world. Governments can change the rules anytime they want. They can close stuff down and tell you that you suddenly have a lot less in that world than you thought you did. So if they say they're going to do it and they do it, I'm the kind of guy who thinks they must have done it. They're doing that right now at the G20 meeting that's running down in Brisbane, and they're going to be talking about how they're going to institutionalize the idea that people who are depositors in banks are merely unsecured creditors in a very long line of people who have secured credits against those banking institutions. That's a fancy way of saying that they're going to take your deposits to make the banks whole again when the banks get in trouble again. And oh, by the way, they will. So why would you keep your money in that system? Alternative investments, why would we call them alternatives? To me, they're actually the only real investments out there. Precious metals, real estate, foreign real estate farms, all of that stuff. To me, you have to figure out how much of your portfolio you want to be absolutely certain will never go to zero and put that part in those investments.
We're living in an environment now, Chris, I feel, where I'm sharing your thoughts, but in this day and age, I'm not so much concerned on a return on my investment rather than a return of my investment, the way things are changing. And I'm very leery of something that can be locked or eliminated on a couple of mouse clicks.
Yeah, well, you should be. And they've done it, and they've done it recently. And anybody who's listening, you should look up what happened in Cyprus with the bail-in. That was a dry run, I think, or a trial run of how to do this. And they picked a small island nation. They ran the experiment. And I think they considered it a success.
Chris, do you believe it wise to have all your entire portfolio in one single nation?
Depends. For people who don't have a giant portfolio, it probably does, because I'm convinced that part 2 of this story involves capital controls. So if you have, a pile of whatever your wealth is, if you can't afford to not have access to part of that to live, you might need to have it all in one nation. But for people who have the capability of diversifying, I think it makes sense to spread it out as much as you can.
Mm-hmm. Do you really think there's any realistic probability that the big bankers and politicians will turn this around before a total collapse?
No chance whatsoever. They had a shot in 2008. That was a time to have said, hey, here were the things that kind of led to this disaster. Let's make these things smaller, not bigger. Everything I track, Barry, that's a risk factor is bigger today, not smaller. That just tells me that they didn't. They've said no. We're not going to manage this. We're just going to preserve the status quo as long as possible, and then someday it'll break, and we'll pick up the pieces. And that's the model they're going to follow.
I know you say that energy, specifically cheap energy, has driven the growth and prosperity up until now. I've heard some pundits suggest that with fracking and new deposits, that the U.S. has sufficient production capacity along with natural gas to not only keep the American machine running, but also become the world's largest exporter to Europe and other nations. I know this is going to be addressed in Crash Course 21, but for our listeners, can you provide us with the following answer? Is there any reality to that line of thought?
No. This has been one of the most profound areas of misinformation that's gone out there. Let me start by saying, yes, there's been a surge in production from shale assets. But even according to the most optimistic estimates, we know that those shale assets for shale oil will peak in the year 2020 and will go downhill after that. We can argue about how fast. I think they actually peak a couple years prior to that, maybe 2018, 2017, depending on the price. But the United States still imports a little over 5 million barrels per day of oil from the world. So the idea that the United States would be exporting to the rest of the world means we need to produce another 5 million barrels per day, and then after that, there'll be some left over. There's no chance of getting maybe more than another 1, maybe 2 million barrels per day out of the shale plays. So the United States is always going to be structurally in a position of being a net importer of oil. Done. Okay. I got the same story for gas, natural gas. The United States today, people don't know this, is still a net importer of natural gas. As much as we're producing, we are still importing from Canada because we need to. And so again, as we look in the story, shale is going to be a flash in the pan. It's going to be there for a very little while. It's not even remotely like what we used to get out of old plays. So there's a big story there, and I invite people, watch chapter 21 when it comes out. It's coming out soon. So hopefully that will have a more complete answer.
I know time is pressed, so I'm going to jump ahead to the final question so I can honor your time commitments. Chris, the Peak Prosperity website is all about the quest for prosperity as opposed to the quest for more growth. It seems to me that prosperity has a different meaning for different people. On the north coast of the DR, prosperity indeed means something different than in a typical American city. For us, prosperity translates to plenty of healthy food and water, surrounded by a less stressful environment. Sort of like downsizing and simplifying our lives with the peace of mind, knowing tomorrow is going to be pretty much the same as it is today. Is there anything you'd like to share with our listeners on how they might make their wish for prosperity more of a reality?
Well, yeah, absolutely. The people need to understand that waiting and hoping that the world is going to somehow be different and meet your needs for prosperity, it's not going to happen. You're going to have to get out there and define it for yourself and make it for yourself. So we define prosperity at Peak Prosperity. It's not money. You can have some financial wealth. That's great. But prosperity means that you're really living in a world that's safe. You've got access to clean water. You've got clean and healthy food that's available to you. You've got deep relationships with people. You don't live in an area where security is a daily concern, or God forbid you live in a war zone. These are all things we know that make us prosperous, and health is really important. So all of these things, whether we really think that, the place to start is people obviously usually have some financial maneuverings to get themselves less exposed to the system. You can do that stuff in a matter of weeks if you need to. Then there's physical things that you can do to become more resilient around energy, around food, water, things like that. Again, for a motivated person, doesn't take a lot of time. But the emotional resilience is really the key to all of this, which I think you're getting to here in that less stressful environment. You're hinting at that. For us, it's the emotional resilience that people have is going to be the most important determinant to their future outcome, meaning whatever financial accidents happen or whatever the economy does or doesn't do, it's going to be people's responses to that are going to be more damaging usually than the actual event itself. So when people are prepared and they've detached from identifying that, my life goes up and down in accordance with whether the economy goes up or down and all of that, forget that. Come to your own terms, have your own emotional resilience, and define for yourself what's important. So that's really what we're looking at just as a starting point. And then we have a lot of advice and suggested at the website for how people can go deeper into those.
In closing, it sounds more like the reaction can almost be more dangerous than the action itself. I wanted to personally thank you because I am an avid listener to your website, and the people at DRescapes know I do my research inquisitively. I would love to ask you, how can our listeners find you the easiest way, and how can they get in touch with the Peak Prosperity website?
Go to peakprosperity.com, and everything's there. We've got 90% of our material is free. We have a subscription service as well for people who like to go a little deeper, and just start clicking around. We've got a great community of people there who are very much in a dispassionate, fact-based way, trying to understand where we are in this world and doing everything they can to become resilient. So I would invite people to just come and check it out and see if it works for them. It's a great community.
Chris, I want to thank you for your time. I know our time segment's up, and I do hope this is the beginning of a friendship that we could work together long into the future. God bless, and thank you both so much for what you do and what you spent with us in your time.
Likewise, and thank you so much, Barry.